The dinner was my sister-in-law Renata's idea. She called it a family reconnection, which was the kind of phrase that sounds warm until you understand who was doing the reconnecting and why. My mother-in-law, Dorothea, had been making noise for months about how the family felt fractured, how holidays felt thin, how she missed having everyone under one roof. Renata, who had been married to my brother-in-law Conrad for 11 years and had appointed herself the family's social director sometime around year 2, decided the solution was a Sunday dinner at Dorothea's house in Calabasas. The third Sunday in October, everyone required to attend. I got the invitation by text, not a phone call. A text with a little house emoji at the end. I showed it to my daughter Lily, who was 9 and sitting at our kitchen counter eating an apple. She looked at the screen, looked at me, and said, "Do we have to go?" "We're going," I told her. She took another bite. "Okay, can I bring my book?" "Yes." That was the whole conversation. Lily had been to enough of these dinners to know that the adults would spend most of the time talking about things she didn't care about, and that the best strategy was to find a corner and read until it was over. She was a practical kid. I had raised her to be. The drive to Calabasas took 40 minutes on a Sunday morning with light traffic. Lily sat in the back seat with her book open before we'd cleared our neighborhood. I drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, running through the checklist in my head the way I'd been running through it every night for the past 3 weeks. The LLC filings, the amended trust documents, the letter from the estate attorney, countersigned, the account statements showing the transfers, every one of them time-stamped with routing numbers and memo lines. The voicemail I'd saved from 14 months ago, the one where Dorothea's voice was slurred and she said things she'd deny saying if confronted without proof. Everything was in order. Everything had been in order for weeks. I wasn't going to do anything today. Today was reconnaissance. Today was just dinner. I told myself that the whole drive there. Dorothea's house was a wide single story with terracotta roof tiles and a lemon tree in the front yard that had been there since before Conrad and my husband David were born. The driveway already held 3 cars when Lily and I pulled up. Conrad's black SUV, Renata's silver sedan, and a newer white coupe I didn't immediately recognize. I sat in the parked car for a moment studying it. Lily looked up from her book. "Mom, we're here." "I know, baby." She waited. She was good at waiting. "Okay," I said. "Let's go." The front door opened before we reached it. Renata was already there, wearing a wrap dress in burnt orange and a smile that was wide enough to be performance. She was 41, stylish in a deliberate way, and she had the particular gift of making warmth feel like a transaction. "Nora and Miss Lily?" She bent slightly at the waist, addressing Lily with the exaggerated brightness some adults use with children they don't quite know how to talk to. "Look how big you've got." Lily, who had heard this approximately 100 times in her 9 years of life, said, "Hi, Aunt Renata," with perfect politeness and moved past her into the house. I hugged Renata, which is what you do, and followed my daughter inside. The house smelled like roasting garlic and something sweet. Dorothea always had something in the oven by 10 in the morning on Sundays, even when dinner wasn't until 2. The living room had been tidied, fresh flowers on the console table near the window, the good throw pillows on the couch instead of the everyday ones. Renata had put effort in. She always put effort in when she wanted something to look a certain way. Conrad was in the kitchen, standing at the island with a glass of water and his phone face down on the counter, which was Conrad's way of signaling that he was present and not distracted, when in fact he was always distracted. He was 4 years older than David, broadly built, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. He looked up when I came in. "Hey, Nora." He crossed the kitchen and hugged me with one arm, the kind of hug that communicates obligation. "Glad you made it. Wouldn't miss it," I said, which was true, just not in the way he meant. Dorothea was in the living room, already seated in the armchair that was tacitly understood to be hers. She was 73, small-framed, with silver hair she kept cut short and sharp. She had a way of sitting very still that people sometimes misread as serenity. It wasn't serenity, it was control. Dorothea had been controlling rooms since before most of the people in them were born, and she was very good at doing it without appearing to try. She looked at me when I came in. Not at Lily first, the way grandmothers are supposed to, at me. A measuring look, brief, like she was checking to see if something in my face had changed since the last time she'd seen me. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. "Nora." She extended one hand, not to shake but to receive, and I took it briefly. "We're glad you came. Thank you for having us. Of course." She looked at Lily then, and something in her expression softened in a way that I suspected was genuine. Whatever Dorothea's relationship with me, Lily was her blood grandchild, and Dorothea had feelings about blood. "Lily, come sit with me." Lily went to her without hesitation and settled onto the ottoman near Dorothea's chair, opening her book again. I watched them for a moment, the 9-year-old with her novel, and the 73-year-old with her careful eyes, and felt the particular exhaustion of knowing things that haven't been said yet. The white coupe outside belonged to Renata's younger sister, Bet, who arrived from somewhere in the back of the house with a glass of sparkling water and the kind of smile that meant she'd already heard something. Bet was 36 and had always struck me as the family's ambient observer. She watched more than she spoke, stored more than she showed. She gave me a hug that was slightly warmer than Renata's, which meant something or nothing depending on how you interpreted her. Good to see you, Nora. You too, Bet. She looked at me for a beat too long. Not suspiciously, more like she was deciding something. Then she moved back toward the kitchen. For the first hour, it was just a Sunday dinner. Conrad held forth about a development project his company was pitching, using the language of someone who believed the details of his professional life were inherently interesting to others. Renata refreshed everyone's drinks with practiced efficiency. Dorothea asked Lily about school in the specific way that older people who actually like children do, not performing interest but genuinely curious about the small mechanics of a 9-year-old's week. Lily told her about a science project involving mold, and I watched Dorothea listen with something close to delight. For a few minutes, I let myself be just a person at a family dinner. Then Conrad set down his glass and said, "So, Mom, you wanted to talk about the trust." The temperature in the room didn't change, nothing visible shifted. But I felt it, the thing underneath the surface of the afternoon, the real reason for the burnt orange dress and the good throw pillows and the lemon tart visible on the kitchen counter. Dorothea settled back in her chair. "There are some adjustments I've been thinking about." Now that we're all together, it seemed like a good time. Renata picked up her glass. "It makes sense to revisit things periodically. Circumstances change." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at her own hands, which was worse. I took a slow breath, held it for a count of 3, let it out. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked. Conrad answered before his mother could. "Nothing dramatic, just restructuring some of the distributions. Making sure things are allocated in a way that reflects the current family composition." Current family composition. David had been gone for 2 years and 4 months. He died of a sudden cardiac event at 44, no warning, no time. One Tuesday morning, he was making coffee, and by noon, I was in a hospital hallway being told words that didn't fit together into a sentence that made sense. We'd been married for 11 years. Lily had been 7. In the will David left, which he'd drawn up with meticulous care, because David was meticulous about everything that mattered, Lily and I were the primary beneficiaries of his share of the family trust. The portion that had been his was documented, structured, legally airtight. Or so I had believed until 14 months ago when I'd started looking at the numbers and realized they didn't match. "I'd love to see the revised documents," I said. My voice came out even. I was proud of that. Renata's eyes flicked to me. "Of course, the attorney is putting together a new summary. I'd prefer to see the actual documents." A pause. Renata set her glass down. Dorothea spoke, and her tone was the careful kind, not warm, not cold. "We'll make sure you're included in everything, Nora. The intention is to be fair to everyone." Fair. I looked at Lily, who was bent over her book, apparently absorbed in whatever was happening to whatever character she was following through whatever story. She hadn't looked up, but I noticed her page hadn't turned in the last 4 minutes. She was listening. And that was when something inside me stopped being patient, not dramatically, not in a way anyone in that room would have been able to see. It was more like a lock turning, quiet and final. The careful, strategic voice in my head that had been saying, "Wait, not yet, you need more time," went silent, and underneath it was something harder and much more certain. I had Lily's college fund to protect. I had the $430,000 that had moved out of the trust account in 11 separate transactions over the previous 22 months, money that was, legally and unambiguously, half mine. I had documentation of every transfer, a forensic accountant's report, and an estate litigation attorney named Joel Faber who had been ready to file for 6 weeks and was only waiting on my word. I had been waiting for the right moment. Renata poured more sparkling water into her glass with a small, satisfied movement, like a woman who believed the afternoon was going exactly as planned. I excused myself to use the restroom. The hallway bathroom was at the far end of Dorothea's house, past the framed family photos that lined the corridor. I didn't look at them. I walked to the bathroom, closed the door quietly, and took out my phone. I opened my messages and found the thread with Joel. Scrolled to the message I'd drafted and saved 3 weeks ago, the one that said, "Green light, move forward with the filing," 4 words and a period. I'd edited it down from a longer version because Joel didn't need explanation, only instruction. I stared at it for 10 seconds, then I pressed send. The little checkmark appeared, delivered. I stood in Dorothea's hallway bathroom with my phone in both hands and felt the particular stillness of an irreversible thing. Not relief yet, not fear. just the clean, certain weight of a door that had swung shut behind me and would not open again. I scrolled to my contacts and pulled up the number for a woman named Claudia Voss, my forensic accountant, who had spent the better part of 8 months building the paper trail that Joel would now use to dismantle the quiet, careful theft that had been conducted in my husband's name. I typed, filing today, stand by for contact from Joel's office. She replied in 40 seconds. A single thumbs up emoji. Claudia wasn't a words person, that was fine. I ran cold water over my wrists, which is something I'd started doing when I needed to think clearly. I dried my hands. I checked my face in the mirror, calm, composed, a woman who had just attended to a private moment and was about to return to a family dinner. I walked back down the hallway, past the family photos, and took my seat at Dorothea's table. Renata was describing the new trust structure to Conrad, something about tiered distributions tied to residency. Conrad was nodding with the half attention of a man who trusted his wife to handle details. Dorothea was watching me. She knew something had shifted. I could see it in the way she held herself, very slightly more still than before, like an animal that has heard a sound it can't yet identify. I picked up my fork. The food was good. Dorothea had always been an excellent cook. Lily looked up from her book and met my eyes across the table. I gave her a small nod, the private signal between us that meant everything is fine, you don't need to worry, and she held my gaze for a moment before going back to her page. This time her page turned. We ate. Renata talked. Conrad laughed at something he said himself. Bet moved quietly between the kitchen and the table, clearing plates with the efficiency of someone who preferred to be useful rather than central. And underneath all of it, in Joel Faber's office 26 miles away, the clock had started. The papers would be filed by 9 o'clock Monday morning. By Tuesday, Dorothea's attorney would receive a certified copy. By Wednesday, the freeze on the disputed trust accounts would be in place. By the time we drove home, Lily asleep in the backseat with her book in her lap, the world looked exactly the same as it had that morning. It wasn't. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Joel called on a Thursday to tell me that Dorothea's attorney, a man named Hargrove who had handled the family's legal affairs for 20 years and was, in Joel's professional assessment, deeply uncomfortable with what he'd been asked to do, had reached out privately. He wanted to discuss an alternative resolution before the discovery phase began. The trust freeze had surfaced documentation that Hargrove either hadn't been shown or had chosen not to examine too carefully. He was not, Joel suspected, eager to be the attorney of record when the full picture came out. They want a meeting, Joel told me. Where? Their office, or we can do it somewhere neutral, your call. I thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Dorothea's house, I said. I want to do it at Dorothea's house. A brief pause. That's an unusual choice. I know. Another pause, shorter. I'll make it work. The meeting was set for a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks out. Joel sent the confirmation to Hargrove's office. Hargrove sent it to Dorothea. Dorothea, I was told secondhand through the most reliable intelligence network available to me, which was Bet, who had called me 3 days after the filing with a voice that was equal parts nervous and resolute, and said, I think you should know that I've been watching this for a long time, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't. Dorothea's response to the meeting request was to call Conrad and spend 45 minutes on the phone with him before calling Renata and spending another 30. Whatever they decided in those calls, they decided together. I spent the 2 weeks getting ready. The Saturday of the meeting was overcast, the marine layer refusing to burn off the way it usually did by 10. I drove to Calabasas alone. Lily was at a friend's birthday party, which I had arranged specifically, and pulled into the driveway at 5 minutes before 2. Joel's car was already there. So was Hargrove's. So were Conrad's and Renata's. I sat in my car for exactly 60 seconds. Counted them, then I got out. Renata answered the door this time without the performance. She was wearing a dark blazer over a silk blouse, and her expression was the careful neutral of someone who had been coached. She stepped back to let me in without a word. The living room had been rearranged. The armchair that was usually Dorothea's was positioned at the head of an informal grouping, Dorothea's chair, a settee where Conrad and Renata sat side by side, 2 chairs across from them. Joel was already in one of them, his briefcase open on his knee, his reading glasses down. Hargrove was a heavy-set man in his late 60s who had the practiced stillness of someone who had seen a great many family conflicts and found most of them tedious. He sat slightly apart, already making the positioning of a man who intended to be the room's moderator, not its participant. I took the chair next to Joel. Dorothea looked at me from her armchair. Her hands were folded in her lap. The expression on her face was one I hadn't seen from her before, not quite defiant, not quite resigned. Something in between, something that was still deciding. Bet was there too, which surprised me for a moment before it didn't. She'd positioned herself on a stool near the window, slightly outside the formal grouping. the observer as always, except that today she'd chosen where she sat with more deliberateness than usual. She gave me a single look when I came in, brief, level, and I understood that she had decided something in the weeks since her phone call. She wasn't here for Dorothea. She was here to watch something be finished. Hargrove cleared his throat. Thank you all for agreeing to meet informally before we proceed to formal discovery. I think it's in everyone's interest to. I'd like to show everyone something first, I said. Hargrove paused. Joel didn't react because he'd seen the materials and knew what was coming. Renata's chin lifted slightly. This is supposed to be a structured conversation, Nora. We all agreed. I agreed to come to this meeting. I set the folder on the coffee table between us and opened it. I didn't agree to any particular order. The top document was the trust amendment, the one dated 14 months after David's death, the one bearing Dorothea's signature and the signature of a notary public named Gerald Finch, who had since retired and whose stamp had been lifted from a different document and applied to this one. Joel had 3 forensic document examiners who would testify to that in court. Hargrove had one, and his report was significantly less confident. Conrad looked at the document. His posture didn't change, but his eyes moved to his wife before they moved back to the paper. That was all I needed to see. This amendment, I said, purports to reduce Lily's share of the trust from 40% to 8% and eliminates the distributions David specified for her educational expenses. It was dated 11 months ago. It was not witnessed by a disinterested party. The notary stamp is fraudulent. Dorothea's folded hands tightened against each other. Nora, the forensic report is on page 6, I said, if anyone would like to read it. Nobody reached for the folder. Conrad's voice came out lower than his usual register. Those are serious accusations. They're documented conclusions, I said, from 3 independent examiners. Renata's hand moved to Conrad's arm, not to comfort him, to still him, I realized. She was faster than he was, and she'd already done the math on where this was going. There were estate planning reasons for the restructuring, she said, with the careful tone of a woman who had prepared for this exact sentence. Tax implications that affected the entire trust. We consulted with advisors. Who? Joel asked pleasantly. A pause, 2 seconds, 3. We can provide that documentation, Renata said. We'd appreciate that, Joel said. We've requested it twice in writing. The response both times was that it was being assembled. The color in Renata's face didn't drain so much as reallocate. It was still there, but distributed differently, her cheekbones too bright and her mouth too pale. She had prepared for a negotiation. She had not prepared for this. Page 12, I said, is the bank record for the trust account showing 11 transfers totaling $430,000 over 22 months. Pages 13 through 23 show where those funds went. 3 of the transfers went to a holding company registered in Nevada. The registered agent for that company is Conrad Aldwell. Conrad stood up. Not violently, he wasn't a violent man. He stood the way people do when they need to feel like they have more options than they do in a seated position, and then he stood there not doing anything with the standing. That account is a legitimate business entity, he said. It was registered 4 days after David died, I said. The first transfer from the trust occurred 9 days after that. Nobody spoke. That particular silence had weight. It occupied the room the way smoke does, not visible exactly, but present in every breath. Hargrove was looking at a point roughly 18 inches above the coffee table. He had the expression of a man rapidly recalculating the terms of his professional involvement in something that was becoming considerably cleaner in its implications than he had perhaps anticipated. Bet, by the window, had stopped pretending to look at anything other than the room. Dorothea's voice, when it came, was quiet. Not chastened, not yet, but quieter than her usual register. This family has been through an enormous amount of grief. What you're characterizing as, Mom, the word came out of me with a flatness I didn't plan, the kind that happens when you've carried something long enough that you're simply done carrying it with grace. I loved your son. I grieve him every day. Lily grieves him every day. What happened to this trust is not a grief response. It was a decision. It was a series of decisions, made over almost 2 years, that transferred money that legally belongs to my daughter into an account controlled by her uncle. Dorothea's stillness took on a different quality. For the first time since I'd known her, 11 years of marriage, 2 of widowhood, she looked her age. Not diminished. Not broken. But present in a way she usually managed to avoid, like the careful armor had slipped a single inch, and underneath, it was just a woman in her 70s who had made choices and was now looking at them from the other side. The transfers were intended to be temporary, she said. The intention was always to. The intention is not the point, Joel said, with the practiced gentleness of someone delivering hard news he has delivered many times. The documentation is the point, and the documentation shows a pattern that the court will characterize as conversion of trust assets. That phrase, conversion of trust assets, hung in the air between us. It was the civil version, the clean version. The criminal version, which Joel had discussed with me privately, and at some length used a shorter word. Renata took a breath that was carefully controlled, or tried to be. It wobbled on the exhale. We can discuss a remediation. The trust freeze is already in place, I said. Hargrove's office was notified Tuesday. The accounts are locked until the court reviews the petition. Conrad turned to look at Hargrove, and his expression was the specific kind of betrayed that happens when someone realizes the person they assumed was their attorney is sitting in the room with a posture that is not technically on their side. Hargrove spread his hands in a way that communicated without words that he was present as a facilitator and not as a champion of any particular party. Conrad, Renata said very quietly. He sat back down. The breakdown, when it came, was not loud. That was the part I hadn't fully anticipated. I had imagined, in the months of preparation, that there would be shouting, that Renata would perform indignation, and Conrad would puff up with denial, and Dorothea would invoke David's memory as a shield. And maybe that would have happened if the documents hadn't been what they were. But the documents were what they were. 3 forensic examiners and an 8-month paper trail have a specific effect on a room. They remove the oxygen from certain kinds of defenses. What's left isn't drama, it's arithmetic. Renata's composure went last and slowest. Her voice dropped into a register that was not quite steady, trying sentences and abandoning them midway through. We were trying to protect, and the intention when David, and this family has always, until she stopped trying sentences and just sat very still with her hands pressed flat on her thighs, like she was trying to hold herself in place through contact with something solid. Conrad didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was to say, in a voice stripped of everything except a kind of bewildered resignation, "What do you want, Nora?" "What's Lily's?" I said. "All of it, restored to the trust, plus the carrying costs. Joel has the number." Joel read the number aloud. It was, with interest and legal fees, just over $512,000. Conrad looked at his wife. Renata looked at the table. Neither of them looked at Dorothea. And Dorothea, who had been the still center of every family gathering for as long as I had known her, who had managed and directed and quietly controlled the current of this family for decades, looked at me, directly without deflection for the first time in this long afternoon. "I didn't know about the notary," she said. I held her gaze. "I know, a beat, but you knew about the transfers." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That was enough. That was, in its way, everything. The settlement was signed 6 days later in Joel's office. $512,000, restored to the trust in full, with Lily designated as the irrevocable primary beneficiary of the educational distribution, and me reinstated as co-trustee alongside Hargrove's firm, whose involvement in the original restructuring was the subject of a separate bar inquiry that I had not initiated, but was not going to stop. The fraudulent notary stamp was referred to the district attorney's office. Gerald Finch, the retired notary, agreed to a cooperation arrangement in exchange for a reduced charge. Conrad's Nevada Holding Company was dissolved by court order. The transfers, now categorized as conversion of trust assets in the civil filing, formed the basis of a criminal referral that took another 4 months to work through the system and resulted in a plea agreement. Conrad entered a no-contest plea to 1 count of fiduciary fraud and was sentenced to 3 years of formal probation, 200 hours of community service, and was barred from serving as trustee or fiduciary officer in any capacity in the state of California for 10 years. Renata filed for legal separation 8 weeks after the settlement. The last I heard, they were in a prolonged and expensive divorce proceeding, and she had moved into a furnished apartment in Woodland Hills, which was not where she had imagined she would be at 41. Dorothea and I have not spoken since the meeting in her living room. I don't know what that means for whatever comes next. I haven't decided that I need to know yet. Bet called me the week after the settlement. She didn't say much. She said, "I'm glad it's done," and I said, "Me too," and we agreed to have coffee sometime, which we have now done twice. She is better company than I expected. She always sees more than she lets on. Lily is in 5th grade. She got first place in her school's science fair last spring with a project on water filtration systems, which she presented with the focused confidence of a kid who knows exactly what she's talking about. She sleeps well. She laughs at her own jokes. She asked me once, about 6 months after the settlement, whether we were still going to Grandma Dorothea's for Christmas, and I told her probably not this year. She thought about that for a moment and said, "Okay, can we go to the mountains instead?" We went to the mountains. It was the best holiday we'd had in years. I run my consulting practice out of an office I lease on the west side. The client roster is fuller than it's been in 3 years, I had let things slide during the worst of the grief, and then during the long months of building the case, and now I've let myself rebuild. It's good work, I'm good at it. Every few weeks, I sit down with Joel's quarterly trust report, and I read the numbers, and they are what they're supposed to be. And I close the report, and I don't think about it again until the next one arrives. That is what it looks like when something is over. I don't hate Renata. I don't hate Conrad. What they did came from a belief that I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't fight, or was too worn down by grief to care about what my daughter was owed. They were wrong on all three counts. That's the whole story. My mother in law lost a daughter in law who would have stayed in her life if she had just been honest. I think about that sometimes, not with bitterness, but with a kind of tired clarity. Some things can't be taken back. You make the choices you make, and then you live in what comes after. Lily doesn't ask about her anymore. Kids understand more than we give them credit for. So, did I go too far or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.